Welcome to Empire State Engagements. I'm Dr. Robert Childs. On the eve of the Civil War, partisanship was rife in New York State, and we can learn surprising things about this at the local level, as Melissa Franson shows in her new article on political partisanship in the Catskills region.
All of this acrimonious splintering is nowhere to be found in these histories. And so as I'm reading these newspapers and I'm seeing how these people are voting and what they're talking about in their letters, I'm like, this is crazy, because this is like a completely different type of atmosphere than what I'm reading in these town histories.
I'm excited to be joined today by Melissa Franson. Melissa is a PhD candidate in the history department at Binghamton University, as well as an instructor in the history department at SUNY New Paltz. Her dissertation research examines how civilians and soldiers from the Catskills region experienced the American Civil War as a lived reality in their everyday lives. She's joining us today to talk about one piece of that broader project, her forthcoming article for the New York History Journal entitled Wide Awakes, Half Asleeps, Little Giants and Bell Ringers, Political Partisanship in the Catskills of New York during the elections of 1860 and 1862. So first of all, welcome, Melissa, to Empire State Engagements. One item that leaps forth straight from the title of your essay is this proliferation of political factional names that emerged in the antebellum period. Whenever I have the pleasure of teaching that period, I always sort of try to work the students through a running glossary of these weird factional titles to keep things straight. And I'll invite you as we proceed to flesh out some of what those terms meant. But I think more broadly speaking, those names emerged from the broader energy and the constant fracturing of local politics over great national issues, but also what might strike us sometimes as factions emerging over provincial minutiae at times. One of the strengths of your essay, I believe, is that it brings us straight into the world, this political world, but in a specific place where people have specific concerns at that granular level that you really bring us to understand in the Catskills. So for starters, long-winded question, I'll ask you to, for a moment, take us to the Catskills. You talk about lived experience. Take us to the Catskills in the fall of 1860 and provide us a sense for the energy, the spectacle, the drunkenness. What was the atmosphere like in politics in the Catskills in this highly contested election?
Well, it was exactly that, like you described it. It was pretty much a party every weekend to try to set the place here. The Catskills region is a very broad way to describe 5 very different, but yet very similar counties. The biggest county as far as population would go would be Ulster, and they have the city of Kingston is their major county seat, and that was a big city at the time, and it's right on the Hudson, so it's kind of a major hub for all the counties around it. Everyone's kind of funneling into Kingston to send stuff down or up the Hudson. So pretty much most farmers that are living in, say, Sullivan County or Delaware County or Schoharie or Greene, they're kind of, Kingston is kind of like their major meeting area, if you will. So Greene is also, you know, along the Hudson, but it's much more rural. Delaware, super rural. The further you get away from the Hudson River, the more spread out the population is, the smaller the cities and the towns get. Sullivan County kind of borders Ulster and Orange County, which is somewhat in my dissertation a little bit, just because there's a couple towns that are technically they're bordering Sullivan County, and Sullivan County, Orange County, commerce, trade, it's not border recognized. So they don't care that they live on the border, right? So the further away you get from Kingston, the smaller the towns get, the smaller the populations are, the more rural we'll say that they are. And then each county has different industries that, so for example, tanneries are a big industry in this region. And you start out with them closer to the Hudson because people from New York City are coming up to the Catskills region, starting these tanneries, and they're moving steadily west and steadily north away from the Hudson River region. But the mountains, where all the hemlock trees, that's where they need to be. So in a way, yes, we can call them rural, but they're super connected as well. And a lot of people that are settling there and starting businesses there are coming from New York City. So it's this weird dichotomy where it's rural, but yet it's not disconnected in any way. So the major cities, the major towns, that's where everyone meets, that's where everyone gets together. So as the political campaigns are ramping up in the late fall, when most of the harvesting is kind of dying down a little bit, now they have time to travel into town and to attend these political rallies, to participate in these marches. They want to party, they're having fun. And especially September, October, when everything's pretty quiet now as far as farming goes and having to get the harvest in, they're huge crowds, and it's something to do. So it offers them an opportunity to get off the farm and go see people. As far as entertainment, there's not a lot going on. It's not like New York City where you have, you know, leisure halls and amusement parks, and the big thing to do is to go into town and attend a political rally. Especially for young people. It's generational too. Even though all of the different political clubs would have rallies and speeches and meetings, the Wide Awakes, the Republican Party organizing organ there, was super excited. They had one person at the top of their ticket. They weren't confused about who they were supporting, and they were young men, not necessarily tied down to business yet, not necessarily owning their own farms yet, getting together, having fun, marching with their, so Wide Awakes would have torches that they would march with. And so lots of accounts in the newspapers about these marches through the towns on Main Street with hundreds of torches. And it was exciting. People loved it. I have a diary. It's very rare to have these great sources like this, but it's a diary written by a woman whose husband they live in Delaware County in the town of Walton. Her husband is the sheriff. Her husband is a Democrat, supports Douglas. Their son, who's early 20s, he's a wide awake. He also plays in the band for all the wide awake celebrations that they have in all the different little towns. So there's this constant tension in the house. Every time the son is going to leave the house to go participate in these celebrations, the father has a hard time. Why are you even bothering? And so this woman, Eliza, writes about this in her diary a lot, about how her husband can't get over this and the son is just ignoring what he's supposed to be doing. So yeah, it's very celebratory. Gives them something to do, get off the farm. And it's younger people are participating more.
Great. That sounds like such a rich source. Where did you come across that?
Oh, so this was great. So this was at the Delaware County Historical Society in Delhi. And that's what's so great about working on a very specific regional case study like this, are all the little gems that you find in the small, very small historical societies, town libraries, museums. It's not like going to the National Archives in DC, these huge repositories, right? It's usually like a little building, and maybe one person might be employed there, but they have 2 or 3 volunteers, and they just spend all day organizing and reading old sources. So Delaware County Historical Society guy named Ray actually was super, super helpful. He heard about my project from a fellow grad student that I was at with in Binghamton. And she told me about this place. And she'd actually edited a volume of Civil War letters from a Delaware County soldier. And she says, oh, you got to go to this place. And that's usually how I would find these places, word of mouth. Somebody heard I was working on the Catskills and, oh, do you know about this historical society? They have all these letters and they have all these sources. So they had a transcript of her diary, which is great if they've already transcribed it, because 19th century handwriting can be pretty hard to figure out sometimes. They had the original there too. So I could look at that too if I wanted, but they had it all transcribed. So I literally went with my iPad and took pictures, JPEGs, and then loaded them up, and I have the whole diary. So it's very rare to find a farming woman's diary like that covers that many years too. So that was like such a great source to find.
Well, that's splendid. I'm glad that you brought it up, because so far one of the things in these conversations that I've heard time and again is, as you said, the gems that people have been finding in sort of local archives and local historical societies and libraries. And so that's been a recurring theme so far on our program. And I'm glad to hear you adding to that. And as you talk about farm life and you talk about people from the farms coming into town to participate in this spectacular politics, you mentioned how these were market towns and they were connected to New York City. And your article notes that this region had increasingly over the antebellum years been integrated into the New York City market and as also southern US markets through transportation revolution, market revolution. And I'm curious how that affected, again, you being a historian who's particularly interested in the lived experiences, how was life changing in the Catskills in this period? Because I think that helps set the background for what you talk about in the article.
Yeah. So as the area became more and more populated, So, when you're talking the early 1800s, 1810s, 1820s, this is very sparsely populated, except for Ulster County. Ulster County had quite a, was pretty settled. But Sullivan County, which is actually was created out of Ulster County. They basically cut off a chunk and said, this is Sullivan County now. In Delaware County, especially, very sparsely populated up until like the 1830s, 1840s. And again, the driving industry there was the tanneries. And so a tannery would set up, and around the tannery would kind of build a town. And so throughout the 1830s, 1840s, there's more and more of that happening, especially in Sullivan County, more and more tanneries, 10, 15, 20 tanneries, and all these towns are popping up. It's still very, I want to say, conservative in their politics. They don't want government involved in their day-to-day lives. That is something that they're rejecting. They see themselves as, pioneers in the frontier. That's something that even in the 1860s, they're describing where they live as the frontier still. In the 1860s, 50, 60 years after they've, created these towns. So they kind of imagine themselves as separate in a way, insulated, but yet they know that they're not, because their very livelihoods are tied into the markets. Into, if you're a farmer, you got to sell your stuff. They're not subsistence farmers. And it's funny because I remember when I came to this project initially, I had in my head what I thought I was going to find here, based on what I had read in the literature, right? I thought I was going to find this Republican stronghold, because it's not New York City. And everyone knows that New York State in this election, if it's not New York City, it's all Republican, right? And I didn't find that. But I also imagined them being mostly subsistence farmers that were kind of cut off, and I didn't find that either at all. So they're very aware of what's going on, both in New York City, but also the South for sure. And that's something that the newspaper editors, especially Democratic ones, are constantly writing about, is let's not piss off the people in the South, because they're buying our butter, they're buying our leather, they're buying our lumber. So they're aware of it. But on the other hand, what starts happening in the 1850s is there's fracturing that's happening. Some people are more interested in keeping government and business separate. Those would be your Democrats, your hardcore Democrats. They're supporting small government, right? Jacksonian idealism there, right? But then there's other more entrepreneurial farmers. Younger farmers tend to be supportive of this, but also if you're more rural, if you're further away from these big towns and cities, you want railroads, you want plank roads, you want turnpikes, because it takes a day or two for you to get to Kingston to sell your stuff, right? So you want to be able to do it quicker. So especially in Delaware County, once the Republican Party platform starts being popularized and they're talking about it in the press, it's opportunity, it's growth, free soil. That's why free soilers are under this umbrella of the Republican Party. They feel like they have to support the party of opportunity for them. It's definitely not about abolition. They're not abolitionists. They're not about that at all. They reject it. But the Democrats, like I said, they're the party of small government. And they don't want small government. They want government to help bring railroads and canals and roads. So it's fracturing along those lines. There is a little bit, just a teeny tiny fraction, minority in Delaware County of abolition support, because they're a little bit closer to the burned over district there, Western New York. They're a little closer. They had a little bit more interaction with evangelical preacher, they had a little bit more involvement in Delaware County. So they do have more churches that are supportive of abolition, but it's a very tiny little fraction. But that's why the Republican Party, though, is so appealing in this region. It's because it is opportunity, and they like what they're hearing. The Democrats tend to be older. They tend to be more set in their ways. They tend to own more property. They're already established farmers. They're happy with the way that their businesses are going. And they want to keep things kind of the status quo. They don't want to alienate the people that are buying their products in the South. They don't want to alienate their New York City merchants that they have deals with, right? So that's kind of what's animating them going into this election, is they really have a fear that their commerce, their ability to sell their stuff is going to be cut off. So they don't want to mess with that. They don't want change. Change is bad for them. So it's very personal. Everyone has their own opinions and thoughts and feelings on this. So we definitely can't generalize the Catskills as any one thing.
Yeah, no, well, I think it's a really fascinating point, and I think you do a really nice job of explaining how they might be all starting from the same basic premise when you say early in the article, I'll quote from you, you say the Catskills farmers idealized an agrarian republic that prioritized land ownership, republicanism, and political democracy, blending these ideas into a local political economy that consistently adapted to changes in national politics. And so that then becomes the second part that makes all this fascinating. They had very divergent interpretations of what exactly that meant in application given the current circumstances.
Yep.
And so that could mean, as you say, we don't want the state interfering in our day-to-day operations, or it could be others saying we can only be an independent Republican farmer if we have access to the market, and the capital R Republican agenda seems to offer that. And so you do a really nice job of showing how they might start with the same basic yearnings, but depending on, and as you point out, depending on geography as well, it really gets complicated from there. It's interesting too, that this then sets up, as you point out, and this is the heart of your article, this context for these voters to look at these intense factionalism of the national 1860 election. And as you have said already a couple of times, what we think of when you or I teach the survey about the factionalism in the 1860 election from a national view, you point out that's not what these people are getting all excited. They're just as excited as everyone else, but it's about very different things. So when people in the Catskills looked at what was going on nationally, how did that sort of interface with what they cared about locally, and how did that start to develop these local factions?
It's funny because, like you said, I kind of went into it thinking I was going to find one thing and I found something completely different. So for some people, again, slavery isn't an issue, right? They're not concerned. It doesn't affect their day-to-day life. They don't think about the morality of it. And especially in the early 1850s, right? But things start moving nationally and start getting heightened in the 1850s that Northerners can't really ignore as much, right? Things like Kansas, Nebraska, and the canning of Sumner, and all of these things that are in the news all the time. And now this idea of the slave power becomes more and more real. Even though it's an idea, they're seeing evidence of it. And some people are very concerned about that, and others are not concerned about that, right? Others benefit from this slave power, right? Especially farmers in the North who are selling their products to Southern plantations, right? And they're very integrated. Also, there's this idea that, and I guess this is kind of where the project even actually started from. When we think of the political contest of 1860, it's like North versus South, right? And all the Northerners were united against, the Southerners, and Lincoln's their man. And all the Southerners were all Douglas or Bell or Breckinridge, right? And no Lincoln. And it's not the case at all. The North was so diverse, way more diverse than we give it credit for. This idea, and I was inspired by William Freeling's, right? His idea that there's so many different Souths. There's no one South. There's no one North. And the Catskills region for New York State kind of proves that to me. This is a region that you would think, because everyone has told us, should be strongly Republican. And they're totally not strongly Republican. They see their interests more aligned with Southerners. The difference, though, and I think it's generational as well, younger men who might have always worked on the family farm, but there's no more land for them to purchase, or they're, it's cost prohibitive to purchase land, or that they don't see that their individual opportunities are being met by the political parties or the people that are running the political parties in their local areas. They're not helping me. They're not speaking to my needs. And here comes this really exciting, opportunity-filled Republican Party, and especially the wide awakes, as they start getting bigger and bigger, and the organization is growing, and everyone kind of sees how attractive this is. They hitch their wagon to that, right? And it does create tension in families. There's families where, father, like I said, Democrat, and the son is Republican wide awake, right? So it speaks to, it's not a north-south divide. It's way more complex and complicated than that. And we don't recognize that enough. It's not cut and dry.
Well, you certainly demonstrate that in this piece. And what's interesting is it looks like in the case of New York, the opponents of Lincoln understood that maybe it was a little bit too complicated for their own good. And so it wasn't, in fact, in the Empire State anyway, four-way race. There was this tense fusion of all of the anti-Lincoln candidates. Talk a bit about that and how it played out in the Catskills.
Well, it's kind of funny because that's something that wide awakes are constantly pointing at and making fun of. Like, look at you Democrats, you can't even get behind one candidate, especially the newspaper editors, right? And they're the middlemen, right? They are the ones that are trying to make these local concerns seem national and national concerns seem local, right? They're the guys that are trying to pull voters to their side, whatever side they're on. And so essentially New York State, they couldn't figure out who should be at the top of the Democratic ticket, right? They decide to break up the electors amongst the three candidates. Now, in the Catskills region, Douglas tends to be the most popular. Most people are belonging to Little Giants clubs, and Douglas is their candidate. So I think there's, I don't want to say the wrong numbers. I want to say it's like 18 or 19 electors are going to go to Douglas. And then about half of that are going to go to Bell, and then a very small percentage are going to go to Breckenridge. So Republicans locally are constantly making fun of them for this. Like, because of the fact that you're so disunified, that's why you're going to lose, which doesn't actually work out. That's not the case, but it's something that they're that's fueling this. It's acrimonious, and they write little op-eds in the newspapers making fun of them. They create these really funny names to call them. It's definitely, it's a problem. It's a problem, and that's why New York ends up going, overall ends up going for Lincoln. But it wasn't a sure thing by any means.
Well, some of the people that were trying to make sure it would become a sure thing, and you talk about them, you've mentioned them already, are these youthful wide awakes. Not only are they young and enthusiastic, they're also rather, you point out several times, sort of martial in their behavior and their antics. Talk a little bit more about how they presented themselves in Catskills society, Catskills communities, in those market towns you're talking about, and their role in this campaign.
I think so definitely the martial aspect, the military aspect appealed to these young men who most likely grew up on farms that are pretty distant from town centers. They might have a couple of fellow farm boys that they hang around with, or brothers or cousins or whatever. But the Wide Awake organization offers them this sense of like brotherhood. We're in it together. They have special uniforms that they would wear, the torches again, marching in lockstep together. It's intimidating. And they like the fact that they're intimidating. They like the fact that people are paying attention to them, because they don't necessarily have a lot of power, right? If you're growing up on your family's farm, and your father's running the farm, and your uncles, your grandfather, or whatever, you don't really have a lot of power. You don't have your own money. There's not a lot of job opportunities out there for you. So this is a way of asserting your independence. It's definitely a generational thing. Most wide awakes are young. And they have these processions that everyone's watching. There tends to be a lot of alcohol involved. They usually end up at a tavern, like that's the end of their route. And it's in the streets. It's one huge party. They like that. Older people living in the towns don't necessarily like that. They write, op-eds in the newspaper complaining about it. Some people are pretty apathetic to what's going on. They're not getting involved at all. They see all these parties as, a pain, keeping them up at night. So it's definitely, it creates a tension. But again, it presents an opportunity for these young men to be seen, to feel like they have some sort of power, some sort of voice. They're excited about participating in politics because they haven't for a while. The younger generation tended to not be the voting, the deciding vote. And I think in this election they are. The fact that they're able to gain so much support, the Wide Awakes are instrumental in getting Lincoln elected. And it's that younger vote that matters, I think. So, at least in the Catskills region, you have a lot more political participation in this region than in the previous elections. They're excited.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating because the energy and the enthusiasm for Lincoln, as you sort of implied a moment ago, if you're a young man growing up on a farm in much of this region, there might not be a future in farming for you there, but there might be one out west, and that's the feel of free soil.
It's that opportunity.
But there's also this opportunity to assert yourself in the public sphere back home, which might not have been open to these young. So in both cases, both there and sort of projecting westward, there's this youthful energy that you really capture very nicely in the article. There were also little giants, as you pointed out,
Mhm.
and this is Douglas's nickname. And did they behave in a similar way? It doesn't sound like they had quite the same youth.
No, they didn't have processions. They weren't marching through town with torches. They tended to gather like, um, in the main square, and they would have long campaign speeches. It tended to be, or picnics. They had a lot of picnics. So women were involved too. They were definitely the quieter of the groups. They went by a couple different names, but Little Giants was the main one in this region. But yeah, definitely not. And like I said, they tend to be older. They tend to be established. They've owned farms. So it is something to do, in the afternoon, go listen to campaign speeches, but nowhere's near as rollicking as the wide awakes were. um, but there was one occasion, and I wrote about this in the article. There was a funeral for the sheriff's wife, and it happened to be going on at the political rally for the Little Giants Club is happening across the street from this poor widower's house, and he's been in mourning. And the anonymous op-ed writer is complaining about this, like, how can they be carrying on with these campaign speeches and the cannons that are going off, and because that was something that was featured in pretty much across the board, was firing cannons and flag raising, the American flag. That was something that was featured like across the board as well. But like I said, there was no marching happening with the Little Giants. But that was a problem for this guy. Like, can we at least stop politicking for like 1 week and let this guy just mourn the loss of his wife? He was sick of it.
Well, I was going to ask about that story, so I'm glad you brought it up. I like the funeral story because it reminds us, we think about these major historically significant turning point elections, and we think, oh, everybody must have been captivated by it all the time. It turns out a lot of people were like, these guys are obnoxious. Like, they're sick of
Yeah.
the campaign. They're sick of all of the demonstrations. And you sort of captured that as well, which I appreciated. And you did it, as you pointed out, largely through engaging with newspapers. And the newspaper research is really the heart of how you approach this story. And I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about the intensely partisan role of the editors. You mentioned them earlier as sort of these middlemen,
Yeah.
and this intensely partisan role they played in helping to frame, as you put it before, the national story in the context of local priorities and local divisions, and how that opened up this world of stories for you during the research process.
Yeah. So I didn't think that the newspapers were going to feature so prominently in my work. But it's really hard to find firsthand accounts, right, in the archives. Um, Thousands and thousands of soldiers' letters, right, during the Civil War. We have so many of them. But before the war kicks off, where are we going to get a sense of what it's like to live here, right? Unless you can find some farmer who keeps like a diary or journal, or someone who is writing letters to family members, there's not really a lot of source material to figure out what it was like there, you know? So I went to the newspapers, and I spent days upon days upon days just reading newspapers, and they're just so fascinating. They tend to follow similar formulas. Usually the first page, so they're usually 4-page papers. So the first page is usually like stories. Sometimes they're like serialized. So like a part one, a part two, a part three. It could be any kind of story. It could be a romance story. It could be traveling. It could be, but that tended to be the front page. Sometimes like almanac type stuff. It would depend on the newspaper, but in general, nothing heavy on the front page. It's the second page and the third page. The inside is where it's all at. So usually the second page is national stuff. It's all the big national stories. A lot of exchanges with, they're publishing stuff from the New York Times, the New York Post, other big national newspapers. They're reprinting those stories. So that news is already like a week old by the time it gets to the Catskills region, but it's still pretty up to date. And then the third page was my favorite page, and that is all the local stuff. And so it can be as granular as how much squash Mrs. So-and-so grew in her garden last week, right? Like it could be that minutia in the newspaper. The county fair, whose cow was the biggest at the county fair. All sorts of little nuggets like that, which I just found fascinating. And it really does give you a sense of what these communities are like. But then once the political contest starts heating up, the whole tone of the newspaper changes on that third page. Instead of, we don't really care about how big her squash is now, it's all about who are the local candidates, which political platform are they running on, what do they support. It's so politicized, and it's really hard to gauge how much it's the newspapers trying to influence the public opinion versus how much are they reflecting what's going on locally. Figuring out that balance is really difficult when it comes to newspapers because there's an editor, right? It's his voice. How much is he reflecting what he's hearing from his readers versus how much is he trying to influence his readers? It's really hard to tell in many ways, and you don't really have other people's voices to tell you this guy's just inflammatory on purpose, right? Versus, oh no, he's hearing what his neighbors are talking about in the tavern, and that's what he's printing. So it's really hard to step away and to not let these newspaper editors tell you, right? You have to kind of interpret them a little bit. And from reading these guys, every week they're putting out a paper, I get a sense of who's really trying to ramp things up and who is trying to step back, give a little bit more of a general overview, of more of a reflection of what's going on. So like James Quinlan, he's a major one for me. He's a Democrat. He ends up becoming, Copperhead, and there's a whole story with him later on. But he's inflammatory. He is on purpose trying to get people riled up. He's also in Sullivan County. Sullivan County is a Democratic county, traditionally voted Democratic. More sparsely populated. They don't necessarily want things to change that much. A lot of tanneries there who see their interests aligned with Southerners. So Quinlan is speaking to them, and he's trying to get them riled up, and he wants them to go vote. And there's a traditional history of them voting for Democratic candidates. Someone like Charles Ackert, who's the New Paltz Times guy, he tries to tone it down a little bit. He tries to give more of an even, he says, we're nonpartisan. We're going to present both sides. Secretly, he's a Democrat, but he's not as inflammatory as Quinlan. And then Taylor, who's an Ellenville Journal guy, he's staunchly Republican. and it's Taylor and Quinlan that are at loggerheads. But he is pro Lincoln. He's pro Republican Party. Taylor is constantly printing these pieces, basically poking fun at the Democrats and their lack of unity, and you're going to ensure that the Republicans are going to win. He's not trying to represent all of his readers, right? So you have guys like Quinlan and Taylor who are trying to be inflammatory, and then you have some like Ackert who's trying to be a little bit more, I think, reflective. And so you get a sense as you read more and more of these newspapers. I mean, I literally read every weekly newspaper for like 6 years. And so I get to know them. So yeah, they're definitely trying to appeal, but they're also trying to inflame, right? And so I don't know how much what people are, who they plan on voting is driven by what they're reading in the newspaper, or is it their own thoughts and, you know, discussions with neighbors and discussion. It's hard, you know, I can't say definitively this guy influenced this many readers and they voted this way because of the newspapers, right? So using newspapers is tricky.
No, it is, but what I appreciate about what you're saying, because I have found, and I always encourage students, I mean, newspapers can be an incredibly rich and useful source. And like you, some of the work I've done on various elections, you read over the same months in paper after paper over and over, and you're just reliving this thing again and again. You start following the news, and you start following different stories and so forth. And that's useful, right, for you, because that might not be what you're writing about, but it gives you their world. It gives you what these people, but also recognizing the hyper partisanship of these newspapers. It doesn't make them less useful. It just makes you more aware of what you're working with. And in some ways it's more useful because it gives you a sense for sort of what exactly the most rabid partisans were saying, and what people were hearing, and what those wide awakes or little giants might have been taunting one another in the streets at those rallies saying as well. And you capture that nicely. And of course, it wasn't just Lincoln versus this sort of trio of alternatives. It was also, there were other things on the ballot, including a referendum in New York State about, well, it's misleading to say it's about Black suffrage, but it's about expanding African-American men's access.
It's dropping the property qualifications, the $250 property qualifications, right? That's what's on the ballot. But when you look at the newspapers, you wouldn't know that. If you're reading a Democratic newspaper, it is, do we want these Black people voting? No, of course. Why would we? They're not, you know, and the list goes on and on, of all the slurs that they would use. And then they tie it to Republicans, right? This is, if you vote Republican, this is what they want. They want amalgamation of the races. They want equality, and we can't have that around here. Meanwhile, you know, this percentage of Black people who are actually living in this region is teeny, teeny, tiny, very small. But their representation in the newspapers, I found was super interesting, and I didn't include it in this article, but it is in my dissertation a little bit about, they're the bad guys in the newspaper. If there's a crime being committed, if there's suspicious activity, it's Black people who are committing these crimes, and they take up a lot more space in the newspapers, given the percentage of their, you know, population there. So they're definitely made out to be the bad people, and even good Black people are suspect, right? So that's a theme that kind of runs throughout my work. When I was looking at this, that I was a little surprised. I don't know why I was a little surprised. But when it came to this vote, the referendum, Republicans are distancing themselves from this. They're saying, oh, no, no, no. We do not support abolition. We're not abolitionists. We don't support equality. And it's kind of like doublespeak. They want you to vote for the Republican Party platform, but they want you to vote no on this referendum. And that's basically what happens. It gets pretty nasty in the newspapers, how people are talking about Black people and the threats that they will have against the ability of white people to conduct businesses and find jobs, and and it's sad. It shocked me when I came across this stuff. It wasn't something that I was anticipating. And so I have one or two examples in the article, but there's some of the less yeah, there was some pretty nasty stuff that I came across. And so when the vote happens, I mean, it's so upside down. There's no, and in I think 3 of the counties, less than 15% of the people who voted for the referendum, to drop the property qualifications. So there's just no support. The only county that comes close is Delaware. And like I said, it's because they have a history there of tepid support for abolition, but they also have more churches and ministers and preachers that are supportive of abolition. So they're hearing it more, right? And for them, it's a morality thing. But it still doesn't pass, right? So the results were not shocking when it came to that referendum. And I like I said, I don't know why I was so surprised to come across that. And then when I started reading the newspapers and seeing how they're talking about this, it's just vile, some of the stuff that they would print in there, especially Quinlan. Quinlan was pretty outspoken about this.
Well, and some of your, even in the article that you did include from Quinlan, are just abominably racist. I mean, just nasty. Did you? I'm curious, because this is not part of the article, but it's part of your broader research. Was in general the anti-Black news coverage more intensely racist in the Quinlan type Democratic newspapers as opposed to Republican, or were they all pretty bad? Or because in your article it feels more like the Republicans are kind of tap dancing and trying to get out of talking about it. Is that?
They are. Yeah, they are for sure. They're definitely, they're avoiding it. They're trying to avoid it. And people like Quinlan are calling them out. Well, if you're not supporting abolition, you need to say so. It's not enough not to say nothing. You have to come out as anti, right? And they're not doing that. They're just trying to ignore it, not address it, or speak to other parts of the platform that are, appealing. Talking about the railroad, the Pacific Railroad. They're talking about free soil. They're talking about the slave power. Anything but slavery is an issue in abolition. So even though, and often, I'm sure you encounter this too, students come into college classes thinking of the North and Republicans as, anti-slavery and abolitionists, right? This is the party that freed the slaves. And it's so more complicated than that. It's not that at all. And even though abolitionists fall under this umbrella of the Republican Party, the Republican Party is not abolitionist. It's the only place the abolitionists see just maybe a glimmer of hope, right? And abolitionists see this opportunity of Lincoln being anti-slavery as a possibility, right? even though Lincoln is quite clear that he has no interest in ending slavery anywhere that it exists, right? But he is at least not willing to let it expand, right? So abolitionists see their only hope, because they've already tried their own party and that didn't go anywhere, right? So it's the only possibility for them. And so this idea that the Republican Party is somehow an abolitionist party, that's something we create. We created this story. Us Americans today have created this story about who Lincoln was and what he did, the great emancipator, right? And the Republican Party was the abolitionist party, and they freed the slaves, and ooh, look at that Civil War. Thank God we did that, and it's over, and we're the heroes now, right? And that's not at all what it was like. It's so much more complex. So
Yeah, and it certainly comes across in your piece that in this campaign you basically have on the question of slavery and on the question even of the rights of free African American male citizens of New York State, the Republicans are at best equivocal and indifferent, but when that's stacked against the Democrats, who are just obscene in their racism, literally obscene in their racism,
yeah,
and their cruel attacks on local African Americans, on in the article on Frederick Douglass. I mean, everybody is coming under there, and so I guess you can see why the abolitionists end up within that Republican fold. There are other people on the ballot, and you talked briefly about Congressman Charles Van Wyck. How does he fit into this story? Because it's sort of interesting.
So Van Wyck was traditionally a Democrat.
Yeah.
And then when the Republican Party kind of took off in 1856, he switched allegiance. You know, he went Republican, and he got elected to Congress in 58. He won his seat. So now he's up for re-election in 1860. The Democrats just hate Van Wyck, especially after he had given this speech on the House floor, railing about the slave power and the Southerners that have the stranglehold on federal power, and this is dangerous. And he essentially foretells this: there's going to be a civil war if we don't address these problems. And so in the local newspapers, you know, the Democratic partisan editors are like screaming about Van Wyck, and his election, and I talk about it a little bit in the article, is super exciting because they don't really know who wins for a while, because they're counting votes and recounting votes, and then they throw out like a whole town's votes because it was suspicious, and nobody really knows. And so then some, you know, after the election happens and Van Wyck just squeaked by a little bit, and I think it's also because he's pretty connected. He's pretty well connected, you know, and he's the incumbent, and he has a history. I think that's the only reason why he wins this election. Do I think there's some corruption involved? For sure. They threw out a whole town's votes for suspicious activity. But he is an abolitionist in a region that it's not popular to be an abolitionist. And even Republicans are a little bit tepid in their support for him vocally, but he canvasses a lot and he travels throughout these communities a lot. He's also technically from Orange County, where Republican, so it's still a Democratic county. Orange County is still Democratic, but it's bigger, has bigger towns, has a younger demographic, because younger people are drawn to these cities, way more employment opportunities. So even though technically it's not a Catskills county, how the congressional districts are drawn are Sullivan and Orange make a district. So even though we have Sullivan County as a Catskills county and Orange County, who's technically like a Hudson Valley county, they're tied together. So that's why I talk about some Orange County stuff in here, even though technically it's not a Catskills county. So he has to try. He doesn't really do much to drum up support in Sullivan County because he knows it's not there. They traditionally vote Democratic, even though he used to be a Democrat. He's kind of turned his back on them, right? So he's really focusing on Orange County if he has a hope of getting reelected, and he does. But I think it's connections that get him reelected. But Van Wyck is super interesting because he kind of, he basically creates his own regiment, the 56th New York Regiment. They call it the 10th Legion, and he recruits all of these soldiers in 1861. And he's the colonel. He's leading this regiment, and it's young guys. They're wide awakes for his support, right? They're going with him as he's canvassing throughout Orange County. So he ends up having so many soldiers that they create their own battery and their own cavalry, and thousands and thousands of men are riled up by him, and he's their leader. So that popularity wins out in the end. But even during the war, when he's, serving his country, and he has enrolled all of these men, they came because he asked for them to join his regiment. He created this regiment. People like Quinlan are still having a problem with him, bringing up like little tiny things like the mail. Okay. He's corrupt because he is putting his congressional stamp on these soldiers' letters, and so they're not paying for postage. And that's corrupt, right? Like little things like that. And it's controversial. It's controversial. The whole postal stamp, using your congressional power to send these letters, soldiers' letters, to the mail for free is a real problem for some of these Democratic editors. It's like, how can you have a problem with soldiers' families getting these letters? Well, it's because they belong to Van Wyck's regiment. Because they're not saying anything about the other regiment's soldiers' letters, right? It's just Van Wyck's regiment that they have a problem with. So Van Wyck is a great character for me. I really like him a lot too.
He's a really fascinating character in your story. He only appears briefly here, but it sounds like he's a bigger part of
yeah, he's a bigger part of the dissertation.
He almost sounds, so he's a former Democrat rather than a former Whig, but aside from that, in his rhetoric and his sort of lightning rod status and his predicting what was about to happen, he sounds almost like a hometown William Henry Seward.
Yeah.
Except he goes off to war rather than becoming a very disappointing Secretary of State who's suddenly like, oh no, I didn't mean any of that. But anyway, that's a different story. So how the Catskills end up, well, you've sort of hinted at this, but the Catskills in 1860 kind of do go Lincoln, but not.
They split. So 2 go Lincoln, 3 go Democrat. So Ulster County is just, I think there's like 200 or 300 votes difference. And Ulster County had traditionally been Democratic. So the fact that they flipped to Republican is a big deal. Delaware is the only county that is overwhelmingly Republican. But again, like I said, they have that history there, and they're further away. So the Republican Party appeals to them. They need railroads. They need plank roads because Delaware County is about as far away from Kingston as you can get in this instance. So they need to be more connected. And so the Republican platform for them it's the opportunity. So that's why they go Republican. And then the other 3, so Sullivan was never going to go Republican. And then Ulster and Schoharie and then Greene. So yeah.
Is Delaware sort of, they seem to be the anomaly throughout this story. Do they have an alternative market to look to besides Kingston?
So they have I mean, they're kind of close to like Binghamton. So they can get to Binghamton quicker than they can to Kingston, but it still takes longer. So I guess through Binghamton, it's the Delaware and the Susquehanna or whatever. Like, it's a different way and it takes longer and it costs more for them. So they would rather hook into the Hudson River, right? It's a day to New York City, right? It's quicker, but it's the New York City merchants that they want to connect with, right? So Delaware County newspapers, it's really the newspaper, the railroad that they're going on and on and on about throughout the whole election. So yeah, but Delaware County is the anomaly. And like I said, more abolition support there. But even in Delaware County, they just squeak by that referendum. Right.
It's interesting. So the part of today's conversation that won't surprise our viewers is that Lincoln did triumph nationally, and that led to even more factionalism and fracturing, which of course people know, but that's not what we mean at first in this conversation, not what people are thinking on the national level, because you've got, on the one hand, sort of the wide awakes do a series of victory laps and they seem to be showboating. You've got Democrats complaining about that. You've got people blaming the outcome on the weather. It was snowy that day. It was raining. You've got people freaking out because Lincoln is going to kill the tanneries, even though the tanneries have been in decline for a while. And there's all these like they seem, because we know what's coming, and it feels like some of these people might know what's coming too. It seems really petty to the point of being asinine, some of these like little, but it really immediately gets politicized, the response to the politics, right? And talk a little bit about some of the local quirky stuff that's going on in the
yeah. So they definitely, there's some hurt feelings for sure, right? Especially in counties that voted Democrat and Lincoln still won. That's suspicious to them, right? It's got to be corrupt. There's got to be a reason, because we didn't vote for Lincoln. So how could he possibly win, right? Definitely Quinlan is really upset about this. He's pissed off. And he does predict, war. This is not going to be good. You elected a sectionalist, right? Cannot deny the fact that Lincoln did not appear on the ballot in most southern states, right? How can you get more sectional of a party if half the country couldn't vote for him if they wanted to, right? But that all smacks of corruption to them. This is suspicious. How could he possibly win if half the country couldn't vote for him, right? And so the corruption cry is frequent. It's loud. Especially in Sullivan County, for sure. Quinlan is loud about it. And most Republican editors, like Taylor, it's kind of like, you guys are freaking out for no reason, okay? Like, Lincoln is not going to start a war. You need to calm yourselves down. Nothing bad's going to happen, right? And then as more and more stuff starts happening, they're still trying to, they're blaming Democrats for riling everyone up, right? You keep agitating this slavery problem and you keep talking about it. Let's just let it go. And they have a sense of themselves as mattering to the national story in a way. So these editors are trying to show how what they're thinking and what they're feeling matters. Southerners are aware how you guys voted up here, right? They know who voted, which counties went Democrat and which counties went Republicans. And Southerners are pissed off, and they're justified in these hurt feelings. And so when South Carolina secedes, These Democrats are like, we told you this was going to happen. What did you think was going to happen if you go elect the sectional Republican candidate, right? What did we told you? We predicted this. Why y'all acting surprised, right? And they start supporting these southern states. So, of course, they're going to secede. Why shouldn't they secede? They're not being represented. Lincoln's not their president. They didn't vote for him. And so they kind of start justifying it. And of course, the Republicans are screaming about this. They're traitors. How can they leave the Union? You can't leave the Union. And then you have some middle of the road editors who are like, we're not going to miss them. We don't really need them. So it's funny how there's all these different perspectives. Everyone feels differently about what's happening. And then there's some direct involvement with New York State and Georgia. This is another little kind of a tangent, but Georgia had bought guns from a New York State merchant, and they end up in New York City on a ship. They end up getting confiscated in New York City. And it's this whole big problem. And the governors are writing back and forth to each other, like Governor Brown in Georgia, he's like, you got to release my guns. We need our guns. And Morgan's like, no, we're not giving you guns. You're seceding. Why would we give you guns? Like, it's this whole thing that's playing out. And there's this tension that's happening. Eventually, sometime in March, they end up releasing the guns to Georgia. But I mean, this is in March that this is happening, right? So there's tension. And the idea that they weren't aware of war coming, I think is a little disingenuous. We cannot say that they're super surprised, right? They see what's happening. And when the war breaks out, I mean, the partisanship just increases that much more between these editors, and it gets pretty nasty. I mean, they would take pot shots at each other generally, by generalizing them to the Republicans. Oh, you Republicans, or oh, you Democrats. But now they're calling each other out by names, right? They're being explicit about who they're calling out, and their attacks are much more personal. And I write about this in the article with Quinlan and Taylor, right? My Ellenville guy and the Monticello guy, they're downright nasty. And Ellenville was a Republican stronghold. And Taylor, like I said, he's a Republican. They burn an effigy of Quinlan in the town square. They're partying down with Quinlan. Quinlan ends up becoming he calls himself a peace Democrat. Later on, they're called Copperheads, right? He's a super controversial figure, and when the war starts, it gets nasty. And it I mean, these communities, these families are fracturing over this. There's no great unified North here, right? And everyone's not, oh, save the Union and Lincoln is our hero and hoorah, let's go to war. That's not what's happening here, right? And it's quite a story.
Well, yeah, and you do a really good job of showing that once the war that Quinlan and others had been predicting does come, it's their pals down in South Carolina decide to start it, and then they start using those guns in Georgia against probably New Yorkers. I don't know what became of the guns where they were used, but presumably, maybe New Yorkers fell on a field as a result. Well, that doesn't, as you point out, bring all these people together and say, okay, well, there are some things bigger than Ellenville versus Monticello. They keep going, and it gets intensified, and it's really fascinating the way you again use these newspapers to give us a sense of how the local dynamics continue despite this national cataclysm now. And the Copperheads, these so-called peace Democrats, they do quite well in the next election that you
Yeah.
discussed, 1862. Now, at this point, all of the things that we as young people wanted to believe about Abraham Lincoln are sort of starting to maybe percolate toward becoming closer to true. He's taking the first step with Emancipation Proclamation. Other things come after your story, at least in this article, ends. But slavery, which Lincoln, as you point out, had always denied he had any interest in ending, is suddenly become part of the war for the North, not just for the South, for whom it had always been the heart of their case, but now for the North as well, for the United States as well. And that, of course, gives people like Quinlan all the ammo that they need to continue making their arguments.
Yeah.
So now this stuff's actually true that they've been saying. I mean, not the
Yes.
nasty stuff, but the stuff about
Yeah.
abolition. It's suddenly real. How does that
Yeah.
play out in the Catskills?
So it's fascinating. So this really has an impact. It bleeds into so many different things. And like I said before, it's part of this larger project that I'm working on. But most clearly, I see it in enlistment for the military, right? So your wide awakes, your Republicans, they're your early volunteers. They're the guys that are going in 1861, early 1862. They're fired up, they're excited, right? Not necessarily abolitionists, but it's about saving the Union, right? Very, in fact, I could say maybe 0.01% of men volunteering for military service have any interest in ending slavery. It does not it's not something that they're thinking about. They're not going to war to emancipate slaves. It's not something that's being talked about nationally yet, right? They're going to save the Union. They're going to make money. They're going because they're bored. There's no employment opportunities, right? There's a whole host of reasons why these men are going. It's 1862 that is a turning point in this region, and not in a way that I thought it would be. When we think of Emancipation Proclamation and ending slavery as being this national strategy, right? That now all these Northerners are going to unite behind this. Actually, when the Emancipation Proclamation is announced, people are pissed. And around the same time, they're talking about the threat of the draft, right? Okay, so now you're going to make me go fight in a war to emancipate slaves? Oh, no. And so a lot of the regiments that start recruiting in this year in 1862, they're struggling to find men who are willing to put their lives on the line to fight a war for abolition. So it's a problem in this region. Eventually, bounties start increasing. More and more money can be made by enlisting. I think that that's a driving force, which is not something that we usually talk about when we're talking about why Union soldiers are going to fight in the Civil War, right? We like to idealize and glorify our soldiers for fighting for this bigger moral cause, something that we've been taught, right? But I think in this region, at least, money is a bigger factor here. In fact, some of my soldiers are very explicit in their letters. They're pissed off that they're having to deal with these emancipated slaves. They're not interested in that, right? And people at home aren't really interested in it either. So it fractures things, it complicates things a little bit more, because then we have Republicans who have to kind of justify supporting Lincoln and his war agenda, where at the same time they're supposedly not supporting abolition. How do you square that, right? And so again, they try to avoid it. We're not in this war to fight for abolition. We're not really interested in freeing slaves. If that happens, cool, let's face it, slavery is not that moral, but they definitely focus on bringing the Union together, right? And they create the Union Party in 1862. And the Peace Democrats and the Copperheads, they're like, let's just end the war now. The Constitution as it is, right? That's their little tagline there, right? Which, if we end the war right now, slavery is still legal. Right? Let's stop killing people over this fractional war here that, we're just killing each other. What's the purpose of this? There is no purpose. Let's everyone go back to the way it used to be. And that's kind of what the Democrats always were. They were the party of the status quo. They're very conservative. They don't like change. They don't want things different. And so that's what the Copperheads want. They want to go back the way things used to be. And of course, at this point, we're on the train now. We can't. But when I approached this project, I thought, based on the things that I had read, the little local town histories, and what I knew as a person that lives here, I had a very different picture in my head. I thought it was going to be super pro-union, super Republican, supportive of Lincoln. Lincoln is the man, right? And the regimental histories that you read, and like I said, the town histories, they talk about the war. Decades later, they're writing, they talk about this as a unifying event, as we all came together and supported this wonderful thing of bringing the Union together, but also ending slavery, the scourge that is slavery. And all of this acrimonious splintering is nowhere to be found in these histories. And so as I'm reading these newspapers and I'm seeing how these people are voting and what they're talking about in their letters, I'm like, this is crazy, because this is like a completely different type of atmosphere than what I'm reading in these town histories, or these regimental histories. Also, like some of these historical societies, they would have like exhibitions. I remember in Sullivan County, the Sullivan County Historical Society in Hurleyville had like a whole display about the Civil War, and it kind of takes you through, this is what they were doing in 1860. And it's all very kumbaya. We all rallied around the flag. Everyone is pro-union, pro-Lincoln, pro-ending slavery. And that is something that we now have read back into the past. And if you actually look at what it was like, it's not that at all. They were not pro-ending slavery. They were avoiding military service because they did not want to fight in a war to emancipate slaves. Money made the difference. The nastiness in the newspapers, you don't see that in town histories, written decades later, right? They talk of the Civil War as if it's this defining moment of unity in the country in the North. It's not that at all, which was kind of sad.
Well, it's interesting. I suppose it's ironic how you, by engaging with the rich and understudied sources available at these local institutions, have now been put in a position to sort of, I wouldn't say undermine, but complicate the stories that are being told at those same local institutions.
It's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I have to tell you, it's uncomfortable I can remember doing my research and going in these little archives, and I have to tell you, they're great places to go, because they essentially just open up their doors and say, have at it, whatever you want, right? Sift through binders of family histories and letters, and I pretty much had carte blanche, right, to do whatever I wanted and read as much as I could and take pictures. And they're great places to do this research. But then when I'm explaining to them what I'm finding, it's uncomfortable, because they want to believe the stories that they've heard about the meaning of the Civil War, why their ancestors fought, how their town came together. They want to believe that it's some unifying event, right? They want to believe that the Civil War is justified because we ended slavery and it was a good thing, right? And we had the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment. It created modern America as we know it. And aren't we so great? Let's pat ourselves on the back because as a country, we ended the problem, right? We ended slavery. It's great. And then when you look back, it's like, actually, really no one was supporting that, and they weren't unified. And something I don't know if I touched upon this in the article or not, but home guards are created in these little communities, and they're basically, you ever seen the movie Cold Mountain?
I have not, but I know of it. Yeah.
Okay, so it's based on a book and victims. And so essentially it's men who for some reason are not serving in the military, and they're tasked with going around and enforcing support for the Confederate cause. So it's something that happens in the South. Never thought in a million years I would see something like that in the North. We don't think of the North as that, right? We don't think of the North as having pockets of, let's say, not so pro-union areas, right? We're taught that the North is all unified and it's one thing, this homogenous thing. And the South, okay, we can agree. You know, we've all seen Free State of Jones or whatever, and we know there's little pockets of disunity within the Confederacy, and that's a good thing because not everyone supported the Confederacy, and that's why it fell apart, right? And we don't really talk about the disunity in the North. And so when I see home guards popping up, where they're basically men who create this martial military guard to enforce loyalty, to enforce, if they hear suspected secessionists or Southern supporters, they're knocking on your door. They're warning you. They're calling you out in the newspaper. That's not unifying, right? That's not the stories that we're told about the North. So it's much more fractional than we think.
Absolutely. And so you complicate a lot of our older assumptions about the North, about rural New York, particularly. And you've talked a bit about this, but if you want for a moment, this is part of a larger dissertation that is nearing completion at the time of this recording. How does this fit into the sort of the bigger picture of what you're presenting in that work?
So the larger dissertation project, kind of my goal is to look at the Catskills region, kind of before, during, and after a little bit, the Civil War era, definitely to complicate what we think we know about the North. It's funny how I came to the project completely not, I didn't think I was going to be doing a case study on a region in New York State. My original project was actually going to be looking at Northern women during the Civil War. And I read Judy Ginsburg's Army at Home in a grad seminar. And I was struck by, she wrote about these farming women and their experiences. And so I started doing a little research, and I couldn't really find a lot about Northern rural women. I could find women who were nurses, the Sanitary Commission, benevolence associations, but definitely more representative of urban areas and what women could do in urban areas, not so much on rural regions. And I'm like, So I started researching in some local historical societies to see if I can find some stuff written by women about what it was like to live through the Civil War. Well, wouldn't you know it, they didn't write a lot, or they didn't save them. I think they were honestly too busy working on farms to spend time writing in diaries and journals. But I found a ton of letters written by soldiers. And in these soldiers' letters written by these men who lived in the Catskills region, I was able to figure out what it was like to live in the North based on what they would talk about in their letters to their wives or to other family members. So it's kind of like reading into the sources in a way to figure out what it was like to be a woman living in a rural region. So I said, well, we often tell the story of the Civil War as either North-South, right? Or the story of the home front versus the battlefront, except for in the South, right? Because the home front is the battlefront. Or it's a story of civilians versus a story of soldiers, right? They can't understand what the other is going through because they're not there. And based on what I was reading in this early research, I think it was, I don't even think I had my prospectus on at this point. I think it was for a research seminar paper. So it's really funny that like all the books, all the scholarship is either or. It's either or. It's either all about the civilians or it's all about the soldiers. It's all about the home front or it's all about the battlefront. But these letters are about both, and they tell both stories. I can tell what's going on at home based on what this soldier in this battlefront in Tennessee is asking his wife, what he's telling her to do, the questions he's answering. So then I got thinking about this larger story of like connections between soldiers and civilians, and these letters and newspapers are kind of this huge network that they create during the war. So I said, well, to set this story, I need to know who these people are. Who are these soldiers? Who are these civilians? So let's look at what it was like to be in the Catskills region before the war. And that's where things got very interesting because it complicated everything I thought I knew. This rural urban divide that I imagined in my head. It's not really that neat. These rural regions are very tied in and connected. And these guys aren't so pro-union. They are it's much more complex here. And then the after the Civil War story is about the stories. So it is a little bit about veterans and how they reintegrate. But the last chapter that I'm working on now is how these stories that we tell ourselves about these communities, how they came to be. So it's about Civil War memory, right? Because I just given you 5 chapters about what it was really like. And yet, if you pick up, a town of Ellenville history or something, or the history of Delaware County, that's not in there. Why is that? What happens between 1865, right, and now that somehow this history is forgotten or it's erased? And it is. It's about how we tell ourselves stories about the importance of the past, the meaning we make of the Civil War, right? Because that's the difference between memory and history, right? It's the meaning that we make out of it, and the meaning has been erased for a lot of this history that's been written. So that's kind of at the heart of it. So trying to bring together topics that aren't normally all together. So not only am I going to talk about soldiers, but I'm going to talk about civilians too, and how they're connected. And rural urban stuff and local, national, it's all connected. We have to stop thinking of these things as all disconnected. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Well, I think you do it very well in the article, and I'm sure that throughout the body of the dissertation, which, as you point out, you are in the very final stages of finishing up, and so at the time of this recording, as a nation, as a world, certainly New York State, emerging slowly but surely over the past month or so from the pandemic. I'm curious how I think there have been so many tales from so many different scholars about how this has complicated their research or their teaching or it's complicated everyone's lives. And I think archival inconveniences are minor compared to a lot of what's going on over the last year or more. But it has certainly taken a toll on graduate work. We've seen a lot about that in the news. Has this affected your own ability in any way, and how have you dealt with it and overcome it? Because you continue
For
to.
sure. Well, it essentially put me a year behind. But I was actually, it's funny, when this all began with the pandemic, beginning of March, I was booking a hotel for DC. I was going to go to the National Archives, and I was going to look at veterans records and pension records, Civil War soldiers. I kind of put it off, thinking maybe I could get away with not going. And then I said, oh, I should probably go. Right. So I was looking at hotels and and then the next week is when everything started shutting down, and I was supposed to go. It was March 16th through the 20th was when I wanted to go. And I think everything shut down like on the 13th or something. And I was like, well, I'm glad I didn't actually book the hotel and pay for it because I heard stuff, and I said, I'm going to wait on that. And I'm glad I did. So I never actually ended up getting to the National Archives, but I was able to work around it. But teaching online as a online instructor, it just takes all your time. And so I was teaching 3 classes all online, and my ability to write, to work, yeah, it was definitely harder. And you have so much screen time that the thought of spending even another 10 minutes to bang out like 100 words or something, like, I just can't do it. I don't have the energy to do it. I need to take a break from the computer. Teaching online takes more time, especially I teach asynchronously. So it's a lot of front end work to get the class all up there, get everything loaded, record everything, get all the websites, the links up there. So that's a lot of labor that you're, output there. And so time to work on your own stuff, it just kind of falls lower and lower on the totem pole. So it did put me a year behind, but I'm motivated now to finish. So.
Well, you've much to be proud of in the process, because while you were waiting to get back out there, you've published an article in what I think we can all argue is a fabulous journal. And I should say, this is not the one. Melissa's will be coming out in the coming weeks, but New York History Journal, and so this is your chance. Everybody subscribe, and you can get. 102.1 is what Melissa's article and other fine material will be appearing in. And as you point out, you're on the final chapter, and it looks like you'll be defending this year. And so that is something to be applauded as well, particularly given all of the challenges facing you and everyone over the past year plus. So thank you for enduring a little bit extra screen time today and talking with me about your fine article, and for joining us on Empire State Engagements. Melissa, it's really been a pleasure to talk to you about this exciting new piece.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity. It was great.